Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. We're going to try another episode looking at 5 fantasy football narratives, storylines, etc. going on, in large part scanning through Reddit's fantasy football subreddit, looking for things that I want to touch upon. And let's get moving. Obviously, if you like this stuff, do the YouTube stuff. That is always very much appreciated. The first thing that we're going to look at is I have Browns rookie running back Quinshon Judkins arrested on misdemeanor domestic violence charges. And this is obviously a big storyline, and it probably will have some big impacts. Is it news or is it noise? And I would say that this is news. The NFL, by the way, is very inconsistent on things like this, so that is something that we have to brings in a variable of we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. So there's a lot of uncertainty. That's the word I was looking for. But the baseline that the NFL has for these types of cases that we should be aware of is a 6-game suspension. That is my understanding of it, at least. They go up and down from that. That's just supposed to be the baseline, their starting point. A lot of the time, the NFL allows the legal process to play out, which can be long and drawn out process as well, so that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes these players are able to get the suspensions a year later, something like that. There are some interesting factors in this case that I think could impact things, like the fact that himself and the victim remained together over 5 days after the incident, but I also don't want to look into that too much because we know that how domestic violence types of situations can manifest themselves with the individuals that are within those types of situations. Apparently, the two of them, Quinshon Judkins and this woman, are no longer in a relationship. What do we make of those things exactly and how they might impact the case and any rulings on it? I don't know, but I will get into a little bit of speculation. There are also additional factors that play into all of this as well in terms of fantasy values of running backs and other players on the roster for the Cleveland Browns. There were recent reports leading up to this that Jerome Ford will be the team's lead back to start the season, which in and of itself did not scare me, but it is warranted as something that we need to keep an eye on for this. Then there is the matter of Judkins' contract, which he does not have a signed contract yet due to a holdup with the second rounders, almost all of them this year. This will all certainly stifle the ADP of Judkins, and it clearly already has very quickly, as it should. Jerome Ford becomes someone to keep in mind in drafts, and their other rookie, Dylan Sampson, also gets a bump at this point in time. Judkins could end up being a significant value if his stock falls enough. However, let's not forget that there was a similar incident in Cleveland with a rookie just last offseason who was suspended for 5 games due to that incident. And that case's charges were reduced to disorderly conduct, which I have a feeling could be where this case ends up due to some of those circumstances that I spoke about. I think that a lawyer could take the fact that they're no longer in a relationship, domestic violence. Once again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on these things, but it's a complete speculation, but I do think that is something that a lawyer could press into to help reduce the charges from domestic violence to some sort of lower charge at least. But the NFL also does their own investigations on these things and will come to their own conclusions in terms of what kind of action that they may or may not take. For now, I dropped Judkins down my ranking significantly. I dropped him down to the running back 34. That was quite a drop, and I think that I might not have dropped him enough. Then we've got Jerome Ford, who I moved up quite a ways, all the way up to running back 41. And Dylan Sampson, I have at running back 47, and I might flop those at some point because I do have some, it's not even that I totally believe in Dylan Sampson as a prospect, although I think that there are some things to really like about his game coming into the NFL. However, I don't believe very much in Jerome Ford, and I think we saw that, the team doesn't either. And then other positions, wide receiver, tight end, to keep in mind, Jerry Jeudy, David Njoku. I still think that the want for this team philosophically is to become much more run heavy, like they were in previous seasons when they had a much better rushing attack than Jerome Ford being their lead back. Will they be able to do that to the extent that they wanted to without Judkins? Will Judkins come back mid-season, be great, allow them to do that at that point? I don't know. What I would say is I'm a little bit more willing to draft Jerry Jeudy. I'm not necessarily like moving him up in my rankings, or at least not a whole lot. And same with David Njoku. Be a little bit more willing to draft him now than I was previously. A little bit more confident in the floors for those guys is essentially what it comes down to. Let's move on to topic number 2 here, and this is going to be a post from Golden Smooth of Reddit. I'm going to put up a couple of screen grabs from the article. We'll look actually at a couple of other articles later, but this one I just have a couple screen grabs, and the title of the article, I think, is "The Winning Strategy for PPR is Robust Running Back, ... and this is why, !" So we're going to move on to looking at the first image up on the screen here, and it says, here's the thing, winning your home league comes down to 3 things. Number 1, luck. Number 2, drafting value better than your league mates. And number 3, drafting robust running backs. So let's look at the top one here, luck. Yes, but there are things that you can do to mitigate bad luck. Might have a little bit of a discussion that's going to wrap back around to luck at the end of this video. But still, some years, bad luck, it can just be too much, and there is nothing that you can do about it. It just happens sometimes in fantasy football. Number 2, drafting value better than your league mates. This kind of makes number 3 irrelevant, right? Which is the whole argument of this post. So that's just kind of a little bit of a funky thing. What I will say, though, is that production is more important than value, and we cannot actually determine value until production, I should say, until the end of the season. We can't determine value until the end of the season because we don't know what the production is until then. Everything is speculation until it's happened in fantasy football. But it's not all luck, and strategy can matter. So let's see what the argument is for robust running back in full PPR leagues. Here is the other clip that I have from the article. So, did you realize that the expected fantasy points for the top 18 running backs is greater than the top 18 wide receivers? Just really quick, going to point out with this. Does not cite any source, and very importantly, expected fantasy points. So I don't know exactly what numbers this is referring to. Back to what he says here. They start to align around the point and by the time, and when you get to running back wide receiver 24, the expected points for running backs starts to plummet around that wide receiver running back 24 area, whereas wide receiver 24 and beyond show a much more steady decline. By the time you get to running back 36, the expected points have fallen off of a cliff, yet wide receivers reduce gradually. So the very, very brief thing that I could say in one sentence here is that at the end of the day, this is a numbers game, what we're talking about here, what he's looking at, and you cannot forget that. So this is something, these numbers that he's talking about is something that I did a large study on a few years back, and I have followed up with that study to see if it has held true year after year. And every year, of course, there are some slight differences, but because of how I performed that study, it's more pooled into tiers of performance and everything. So generally speaking, that information has held true. And as the league gets more run heavy, if that trend continues, then the differences between where that study's results lie and where the NFL is headed do quite probably become a little bit greater. But there are some theoretical pitfalls that you can fall into when you look into this type of data regardless of that, versus the reality of implementing this information, its true usage. And that's ultimately all that matters. So, the production floor of your top few wide receivers and running backs is basically the same as one another. Wide receivers, however, have a higher ceiling in full PPR, and the advantage over its own position is greater than the running back. So, for instance, the advantage that you get from having the wide receiver 1 versus the wide receiver 2 in any given week and season long is greater than the running back 1 versus the running back 10. And that is true of the top few end-of-season performers. When you look at the next 15 or so players across both positions, the story stays the same. The floors are about the same as one another. However, the wide receiver's ceiling is still higher. The wide receiver 7's ceiling is still going to be higher than the running back 7 ceiling, and just like before, the wide receiver 7 is still going to provide you a little bit greater of a difference between them and the wide receiver 15 than the running back 7 and the running back 15 throughout this season. But you will see that the running backs fall off quicker, as stated in this post, which actually happens before the running back and wide receiver 24, which he kind of alludes to too, but the idea here of what he's saying is definitely correct. The pitfall that I allude to comes into play with this final sentence in this paragraph, being by the time you get to running back 36, the expected points have fallen off a cliff, yet wide receivers reduce gradually. Numbers game, remember this. So, there are 3 wide receivers on the field, most downs for most teams, and only 1 running back on the field, most downs for most teams. So, of course, by the numbers, as you get into the depth of the running back position, not only does the production tank, because there are no more running backs getting touches, or they're just getting very few touches, but also because some of them just have terrible weeks and whatnot, and injuries happen, etc. Of course, that also happens for the wide receiver position, but because of the numbers game, it impacts the running back position to a greater value when you look at the numbers that he's citing here. The thing is, you are hopefully talking about actual usage case here, you're hopefully never starting a guy that's expected to be the running back 36 on a week. Very rarely if you are. A non-starting running back for a team otherwise, you very well may be starting a wide receiver who is projected to be the wide receiver 36, however, and in fact, someone in your league almost certainly is pretty much every week, unless you're in, just smaller league formats. So the problem with this guy's hypothesis comes into play when we look at what happens if you ignore the top-end wide receivers, the opposite, the antithesis of exactly what he's arguing for. And what happens are 3 things that I'm going to highlight here. So number 1 is that you miss out on a higher weekly ceiling that I just talked about. Number 2, you miss out on a statistically more likely larger gap between your high-end wide receiver 1 versus your opponent's wide receiver 1 than you would expect to get with your high-end running back 1 versus your opponent's running back 1. And number 3, you start to rely on a pool of wide receivers. We're talking about those wide receiver 40s and below that. That is highly inconsistent, and most likely, by the data from the stuff, my studies, will put you at a net disadvantage versus your opponent's wide receiver 3, flex wide receiver, or even wide receiver 2 most weeks, depending on your opponent specifically, of course, depending on how much you are fading the wide receiver position, and also, of course, if you did a good job or not in your draft. At the end of the day, the players that you take and the production that they have is all that matters within reason. We know that you can draft a wide receiver 40 in ADP and get a wide receiver 1 production from them with a little bit of luck. So we're talking end of season numbers a little bit there, but when it comes to the actual draft, you can find those values within the draft. I personally do like to have a good running back room, and I think currently people do tend to fade them a little too much, or maybe too many people are trying to fade them within a lot of people's leagues and drafts. And you can get some really good values because of that. So, should you wait to get those values later on, or is that a value already there in the first round of your draft? And that's going to depend on what players were drafted in your specific draft prior to your pick, and of course your opinions on individuals, and how they've performed on the season, which we cannot predict with complete accuracy, though we do a decent job of that preseason, given what kind of information we do and do not have. do you have to draft 3 running backs in the first 4 rounds to win your league like this post is trying to get you to believe? They don't specifically say that, but you get the idea here. The answer to that question would be no. Can you still win by doing that? The answer to that question is definitely yes. And as this poster points out, the popularity of zero running back and hero running back have helped to open this opportunity up greater to go robust running back and have that work in some drafts. Ultimately, the best strategy is to draft the best player available throughout your first few rounds, and then you let that dictate your strategy the rest of the way. There are a bunch of micro strategies that you may or should try to implement, some that you shouldn't, that don't matter, but obviously, a basic strategy to not do would be to draft 10 kickers in the first 10 rounds. Speaking of just some sort of micro strategy, well, that would be a terrible one if anybody ever were to argue for that, which they don't, obviously. But ultimately, you should never go into a draft with a preset plan. You take the opportunities given, and then you work from there within the draft. Another factor that should not be ignored in all of this is league size. And that opens up a whole new can of worms because, once again, you cannot ever look at one piece of data without looking at another 7 pieces of data. I would argue in really small and really large leagues, those are the leagues where you should be more willing to take a running back in like the first round, let's just say. That's going to bring us on to the third one, shorter one here, which is a little bit of news coming out from Denver. The Broncos likely to use Marvin Mims as their wide receiver 2 this season. And I am, from the news or noise argument, I'm going to call this one noise. I'm not saying not to draft Marvin Mims if you want to as a late round flyer. But Sean Payton hyped this dude up all last season throughout the season, and he still barely made it on the field. He had a 29.7 route participation on the season. He was great when he was on the field, though. This Denver offense is probably going to be a limited passing attack, in part because of the defense and the fact that Sean Payton will rely on the run. He likes to rely on that. I still think, best case scenario, Mims will be too inconsistent to reliably ever trust putting into a lineup, and thus he's just going to end up being a headache and either back out on the free agency as a free agent and sometime on your waiver wire or whatnot. So, once again, noise to me on Marvin Mims. That's going to bring us up to the fourth topic, and we're going to pull up Reddit and just look at this next article, which is running back 1 and running back 2 finishes are heavily dependent on winning. It's not an article, it's a Reddit post. All right, so here it is. They titled it, "The Importance of Winning to Running Backs in Fantasy Football." And so we can get through this kind of quickly, but there is some specific analysis that they did relevant to this year's win totals and whatnot that I do just want a quick look at, and have a list of running backs that we'll talk about quickly. But the general idea here is very basic, very obvious, very intuitive, and very true. And that is that running backs on winning teams are going to have more fantasy value for you because teams run more when they win games, and more opportunities means more fantasy points for the running backs. Now, it doesn't all come equally to the running backs, so we'll get that when we look at the list of names that they presented here. But over the last 2 seasons, the running back 20s averaged 4.8 more points per game in wins and losses on a per game basis. These running backs averaged 18.7 in wins and 13.9 in losses. Of this group of 40 running backs, which I don't know what group of 40 running backs they're referring to, but whatever, only 5 averaged more points in losses than wins in a given season, and 2 of these 5 lost less than 5 games throughout the season, also known as a low sample size, which is just always true when we're looking at the NFL, because the season is a low sample size, and every season things change, so we can't go back historically, with too much reliability on that historical data, because, once again, so much changes season to season for every team, and for most teams drastically. In 2023, top 20 running backs went 172 and 138 win-loss record. 2024, 183, 137. These running backs and their teams averaged 9.6 wins, prorated for a 17-game season based off blah, blah, blah. Simply put, running back 1s and 2s accumulate their points from wins. Looking at the draft, the win totals expected for teams with over 9.5 games for the betting odds. The teams are the Ravens, the Bills, Bengals, Broncos, Lions, Packers, Texans, Chiefs, Chargers, Rams, Vikings, Eagles, Niners, Buccaneers, and Commanders. And what they do is they're going to take away, let's try to spot some value is the point of this running back list that they have. So we're going to take out the guys who are going, high up in the draft, the top 20 or something like that. He says ADP below 40. All of these backfields are a little bit ambiguous, true, but here it's part of the risk reward of grabbing these guys. There is, of course, that's part of why their ADPs are lower as well. But here's the guys put on winning teams, running backs that you can expect to maybe for them to outproduce their ADPs in part because of the fact that they're in better situations than other running backs. And the list that they have is Omarion Hampton, R.J. Harvey, Aaron Jones, Isaiah Pacheco, Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler, Najee Harris, Jordan Mason, J.K. Dobbins, Kareem Hunt. Not universally, but generally on this list, I am a little bit more bold on several of these players than the current ADP. And part of that reason is because when I do my rankings, I am thinking of, are they on a good team? Is that good? But I'm not going to talk about each of these individuals individually, but I do want to say, once again, context always matters, and the reason that the running back gets on the field, the reason that the running back gets carries is going to matter. So for purposes of what we're looking at here for winning teams, running backs who are going to be on the field when they have a lead are going to be more important than running backs who are the third down running backs, the receiving backs, the running backs that are going to get on the field more when they're trying to catch up to a team. So an easy example here that he has next to each other is going to be Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler. When the Washington Commanders are winning games, Brian Robinson is the guy who's going to end up being on the field more later game as they're trying to milk out the clock. Not so much Austin Eckler. He's more situational, of course. That's always going to help him to get on the field in situations, and they like to use him, and that's why I'm still higher on him in ADP. But in terms of looking at this purposeful list here, I'd say Brian Robinson is the one who you would think should benefit the most from this analysis that we're looking at. And there's a couple of other groups on here when you look at J.K. Dobbins versus, I always forget which one of these guys is on that, R.J. Harvey. J.K. Dobbins is that plotting running back out of the two that you would anticipate will be on the field more in positive game scripts than R.J. Harvey. However, I'm still very bold on R.J. Harvey, and I think I think he's a good value still in drafts, but that is something to keep in mind, not only for J.K. Dobbins' draft value, but also for R.J. Harvey's in a more negative sense than that, something that maybe I am overvaluing R.J. Harvey with, I would say, especially to start the season. Yet J.K. Dobbins probably going to be the one to take carry number 1. I don't know about carry number 2 and carry number 3 in the game. And throughout the season, when they are in those positive game scripts, which because of that defense we expect to happen enough, J.K. Dobbins is probably the one to be getting those carries as well. I think he has a floor. I don't know about his ceiling, R.J. Harvey. I think he has a good ceiling, and I think because of receptions and how an offense usually will be run here in Denver and how they want to run things and the reason that they drafted him, I think that he also has a good enough floor and still has a ceiling because he'll be the one in there in plenty enough good high upside situations around the goal line because he's very, very talented around the goal line, and there's some nice trick stuff that Sean Payton will be drawing up with him as well around the goal line, some wildcat stuff that he can do, etc., which should help to bump up that floor for touchdowns as well. The other one in here would be Aaron Jones, Jordan Mason, and I would say Jordan Mason would probably be the one to benefit out of the two more so in positive game scripts. So there you go. That's going to bring us on to my next article, which is Avoiding the Packers wide receivers, ? Why ambiguity could lead to a breakout. And this is some very interesting, well thought out, well put out analysis overall here. So reason 1 is that elite wide receivers often emerge from ambiguous rooms. So that obviously I would hope that is the conclusion that you have come to if you're going to present to us this ambiguity could lead to a breakout. So since 2016, there have been 20 teams with 3 wide receivers with at least 70 targets without any of them exceeding 190 targets. So we have teams with 3 players earning a substantial number of targets, but no one hitting a high-end target share. One of those teams in this list is the Green Bay Packers, which of course does not have any 2025 data. So ultimately, our data set here is 19 teams. And we saw the next season, top targets earner on those teams hit at least 120 targets 10 times, or 52.6% of the time. So obviously, risk reward we're talking about. 50%-ish type of deal here historically. And we can break these 19 next year target leaders into 4 buckets. Yeah, you could break them into 6 if you really want, but obviously good buckets here. So you can see the data there. Ultimately, for this information here, well, I'll point out about a third of the time, 6 of those receivers out of the 19 times. So about a third of the time, a receiver on those teams has 140 plus targets the next season, and 140 plus targets will get you into that wide receiver 1 potentially territory. It's that kind of opportunity to be a wide receiver 1. So that's not too bad when you compare to that 50% chance, but still also 120 to 139 targets here, about a fifth of the time. What I will say here, though, is I would have rather seen this data set begin at fewer than 100 targets, because 100 plus targets is still very fantasy viable. Receivers with 100 to 119 targets, this little group, are more often than not going to be your back-end wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 3s / flex options in that territory. Now let's move on to this second reason that he's going to cite here. So reason number 2, the Packers' passing volume is due for a bounce back when talking about finding a leader out of the ambiguity of this wide receiver backfield. This, more opportunities in general, more passing attempts would help to increase the odds of that happening. I'm not so sure about how much of a bounce back that this passing attack will have compared to the rushing attack. There was a very, very obvious philosophical change that began last offseason for this offense, changing it from the Aaron Rodgers offense to the Jordan Love offense. Also, one that mirrors where the league is heading with this rushing resurgence that we really saw come to fruition last year, something that I think has been ground swelling, but, basically McVay for the Rams kind of perfected it and showed how effective it is in the modern NFL based on how defenses have altered to what was a more pass-heavy offensive system going around. And LaFleur's roots are with McVay within that Shanahan system. So because of Jordan Love's inherent inconsistency as a quarterback, something that I don't really see improving too much. Obviously, you could have individual seasons where it doesn't rear its ugly head so often, seasons where he's just hot for a lot of the season. But because of that, something that I think that they view in the same manner as I do, it makes sense that the Packers would have a more run-heavy, run-first style of offense. A run game mitigates Love's inconsistency by putting him in easier passing situations, by taking some of the pressure off of him, by not allowing the defense to pin their ears back and just send that pass rush at him. And just purely based on numbers, it mitigates the swings, the wildness of the swings of good and bad plays by just having fewer opportunities for those swings to happen. So that's my thoughts about one of the reasons why this, will be harder to happen for somebody out of this wide receiver room in Green Bay to end up coming through this season as a big-time fantasy impact. But finally, the question is brought up, so who could break out of this wide receiver room in Green Bay in 2025? And he just wants to look at, he looks at more of them. You can always read this article. It is by user Brosophus. So he has his list here, Matthew Golden at the top of it, Jayden Reed, Romeo Doubs, and I'm just going to say that I agree Matthew Golden is the one. But ultimately, once again, going back to context always matters. You cannot disclude context. So when we look at those 19 teams, what was the individual context of each of those situations? That matters for those situations. I don't know what those situations were. I'm just saying that it matters. And so it matters for the Green Bay Packers situation as we come into this 2025 season, and what we can and can expect and what the odds of that may or may not be. So for Matthew Golden, I think what we should do with him is, first of all, recognize that, this is some good information. That's very interesting. There is an opportunity here coming out of an ambiguous backfield, going into potentially a more target-focused receiver coming out of it this season. And if you look at historically, typically, what does a rookie wide receiver that is fantasy viable season look like? It's going to start out slow, and then week 7, 8, wherever that time period happens, after the bye week, the second half of that rookie's season is more often than not when they have that breakout. They might have 1 or 2 games prior to that where they're pretty solid, but the main thing here is going to be that if you draft Matthew Golden, then keep that should be your expectation when you're drafting him, is that he's going to be a second half of the year kind of player. And so when it comes to things like luck and building a team appropriately, these are the things that you need to keep in mind. So I just want to use an example here about taking a chance on the Matthew Golden breakout with your team, and what kind of team makeup it might work better for taking that kind of chance on, and what team it wouldn't work better for. So let's take the example of your first 2 wide receivers that you draft are T. Higgins and Puka Nacua, 2 guys who have not stayed healthy ever throughout the entirety of a season. If you were to draft Matthew Golden as your 3rd wide receiver, let's say, what happens if one of those wide receivers misses some time early on in the season and you can't draft Matthew Golden yet? Well, okay, you took the chance on Matthew Golden. It's kind of backfired here, a little bit of bad luck. How do you now mitigate that with your next draft pick? These are the micro strategies that you have to come up with, think about while you're drafting your team. So if you were in this situation to then draft Matthew Golden on that team, you need to think about drafting somebody who maybe has a high floor in case Matthew Golden's not ready to go into your lineup, but you need someone that you can trust in your lineup because one of your first guys got injured, or even somebody that you might have to put into your flex. I guess maybe like a Cooper Kupp is just somebody, an aging wide receiver, maybe even Deebo Samuel, like some of these aging guys you can get a little bit of a value on a little bit later in drafts who, like the ceiling doesn't feel like it's there, but at least they'll give you this pretty trustworthy floor because they just are talented receivers that are going to provide that within their offense. That's what I would do next. So now let's take that example further. You've got T. Higgins, you've got Puka Nacua, you took Matthew Golden, you take Cooper Kupp, you take Deebo Samuel, whatever the case. Let's just go with this Cooper Kupp example. Cooper Kupp's also got his own injury concerns in recent years, a little bit unreliable in that matter. So now you're looking at the rest of your draft and you're saying, I definitely need to get one more receiver in here, and probably might want to get 2. Maybe I make sure to get a steady quarterback who's not a high injury risk, and instead I normally grab 2 quarterbacks, but because of the risk that I have taken at my wide receiver position, instead I'm going to just take 1 more wide receiver than I normally would on the roster. Those are the things while you're doing drafts that you take, and ultimately the reason that you think of these things is to help mitigate a bad luck situation. If bad luck were to strike, how can you recover from that to the best of your ability based on draft strategy? So there we go. I hope some good lessons in there for you. Thank you very, very much for tuning on in. We'll end this there. Like, comment, subscribe, all very much appreciated. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have started to do mock drafts. So please come on and join us for those. Peace out.